All right, well, we might get underway. Yeah, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for coming along to the sixth Wells Paleontology lecture. I'm Gavin Prideaux, paleontologist here at Flinders, and yeah, it's my pleasure to welcome you all here. I'd like to start by acknowledging the fact that we're meeting on Ghana country today. And pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and pay respects to the traditional owners of all the lands that we work on as paleontologists at Flinders. So the Wells lecture series started in 2018 and it's named after Rod, who you'll, if you don't know him already, you'll get to meet him soon, who was the person who set up paleontology at Flinders in the first place. And this is the first Wells Paleontology lecture that consists of 3 speakers instead of 1. And it's and they're basically showcasing local talent in the form of 3 early career researchers in Rex Mitchell, Aidan Couzens and Isaac Kerr. And each of them, over the course of their short but amazing careers, have made some really cool discoveries about kangaroo evolution that they're going to talk about this afternoon. That's enough from me. I'd like to hand over to Rod now, who's going to introduce tonight's speakers. Thanks, Rod.
I was thinking when I was driving here, we got 3 PhDs and I'm thinking, what? There was something else with 3, and I thought the 3 tenors. You remember the 3 tenors? Pavarotti and I can't even remember the names, Carrera, yeah, and so forth. And I thought, well, we got the 3 doctors, but of course, what sort of doctors are? What are you looking at me like that, Lynn? So, I'm not. I've got my wife keep my shirt done up. Yep. Okay. So, yeah, 3 doctors, and that would conjure up the ideas of a medico, or is it a physiotherapist, or is it a chiropractor, or is it someone running a chemist shop or whatever. So doctor, putting doctor in front of your name seems to be something that all these societies like to do. But our speakers tonight are doctors. They have PhDs. They're doctors in philosophy. In a way, they're the only true doctors. Right? And I was thinking, what is it that encourages a young person to undertake a PhD in something like paleontology? You don't see shares in paleontology on the stock market. You don't see futures trading in paleontology. There's something else. Something else is driving them. And I remember I noted in my brain a comment by Aristotle: give me a child until they're 7 and I'll show you the man. And of course, given the time, 400 BC, he's talking about that. So something in early childhood that's important. And I'm a great believer in that. Those first 7 years of a child's life are critical when they develop their sensory systems and so forth. So this spirit of inquiry, this driven to try and understand things, is probably something that's traced right back to childhood. And those of you who can't escape this urge to investigate and something, think back, there's something in your early childhood that it came at the right time that stimulated you. And so you can't sort of escape that history. You're driven by curiosity, you're driven by knowledge and wisdom. And hence that's the reason, you know, you have a PhD. Our speakers this evening, our three speakers this evening, Dr. Rex Mitchell, Dr. Aidan Couzens, Dr. Isaac Kerr, they're all driven by this spirit of inquiry and this need to understand. And so I'd love to know what it is in their early childhood that triggered off that. And it's in their DNA. You can't sort of escape it. It's the way you're made, the need to know, the spirit of inquiry. I remember reading a book on Richard Burton, not the actor, but the explorer. Richard Burton, the polymath, discovered the source of the Nile, first European to penetrate Mecca and Medina, fluent in many languages, an incredible writer and so forth. And he had this same sort of restless inquisitiveness. It's in his DNA, and I think that's also in the DNA of Rex and Aidan and Isaac. Okay, so where are we? The focus of the speakers tonight is on the extinct kangaroos, and the extinct kangaroos are undoubtedly, you know, some of the icons of us, or kangaroos are icons of Australia. The Qantas kangaroo. Anywhere in the world, your kangaroo, it says Australia, and these fossil ones are the icons, if you like, of the megafauna. And of course, the doyen of understanding the extinct stenurine kangaroos was a young student who'd submitted his PhD here in the year 2000. Gavin Prideaux, Professor Gavin Prideaux. Right? So my first encounter with the stenurines was 61 years ago, when I squeezed through that impossibly small space in Victoria Cave and broke through into the fossil chamber. And I was confronted by the first complete skulls of a stenurine kangaroo sitting there, two of them. And I, as clear as day, I remember picking the skull up and sort of rotating it round, and my engineering brain was kicking in immediately. The tooth row was elevated, the cranial region, the brain was elevated above the tooth row. The nature of the jaw, all of this said a powerful bite, and it had this small array of incisor teeth, which was very koala-like. Without any further analysis, just in that moment, I thought, this is like a koala-like kangaroo. This has to be a leaf-eating kangaroo, and it stood in contrast to the long-faced kangaroos that we were used to. The interesting thing about our speakers this evening, I asked them about their previous careers. Now, Rex is an accomplished chef, but he's also a closet engineer. The way he looks, the way he looks at things is the way an engineer looks at things. The other thing, I'm looking at this skull, I'm looking at the teeth. And looking at the nature of the teeth, and they're different from the teeth of the modern grazing kangaroos. And Aidan is someone who's absolutely fascinated by teeth, dentition, and nature of the hard mineralised body, mineralised material in the body, the teeth. So Gavin said to me, "Oh, do you mind sharing your office with Aidan?" Oh, thanks, Gav. Aidan and I have had some fantastic discussions sitting there tracking over all these ideas. And then there's the ecology. Where the hell do these extinct kangaroos fit into the bigger picture? what is it telling us about what Australian vegetation was like at that time, and it paints a picture of a world that's gone. So that's the sort of thing that I got a kick out of 61 years ago, and tonight to me is like the wheel has gone full turn. We're coming back to it. Rex is going to talk to us about skulls, which he has that passion for understanding. Aidan's going to talk to us about dentitions. And Isaac's going to stitch this together into a sort of broader ecological picture. So, great pleasure for me to invite, I think, Rex first to come up and speak to us.
Thank you. All right, thanks everyone for coming along today, and thank you, Rod, for inviting me to speak. Rod's work really formed the foundations of a lot of what I do, so it's a real honour, thank you. And yeah, we're taking place on Kaurna country today. Let's start with what we know. Australian marsupials are unique, and I'm not just talking about the ones that people travel from all over the world to come and see that are around today, but also the extinct megafauna that really showcase a lot of what diversity marsupials are capable of. But marsupials are a bit different to other mammals, aren't they? Compared to placentals, which is most other mammals, they're born extremely young, about the size of a jelly bean or a rice grain, depending on the species, and then they move up into the mother's pouch and latch onto a teat and suckle until their development is done. And this involves early development of the bone in the jaws, and which has been suggested for decades now to maybe be somehow limiting or constraining the ability for their skulls to adapt to these weird and wonderful shapes and functions. But what if it isn't a constraint? What if it's just a different evolutionary approach or strategy, if you will, that can actually be beneficial in some cases? Well, today we're going to go on a bit of a journey. I'm going to break down how my earlier research into kangaroo skull diversity really started to sow the seeds of a new way of thinking about how skulls function and evolve across all mammals. And then I'll provide a bit of a discussion on some of the Narracourt locals, the marsupial lion and the short-faced kangaroo. And hopefully what you'll see is that far from just being limited or handicapped in any way, marsupials are actually sometimes even able to outperform placentals in some cases. 10 years ago, a young Rex starts his PhD in kangaroo skull feeding biomechanics. Now, I didn't know a lot about skulls back then, but I could tell when things weren't quite adding up. And there was some conflict in the field at the time. And this came down to two main directions that people were looking at. There was the established mechanical principles, which suggested that animals that tend to bite harder often have shorter faces. This increases the leverage or mechanical advantage, which is how much of that muscle force is converted to bite force at the teeth. So you often have shorter faces to generate a harder bite. They also have wider skulls to house more jaw muscles. And they also often have deeper skulls, which provides more bone to more evenly distribute the stresses during biting. This was all very straightforward. And then in 2013, a new hypothesis came along called craniofacial evolutionary allometry, or CREA. And this suggested that among closely related species, larger ones tended to have longer faces. And this was established in species like squirrels and mongooses and fruit bats, and even kangaroos and wallabies at that point. But there were some things that didn't quite add up between these two. For example, what if you had a larger species that needs to bite hard? Does it have a longer face or a shorter face? I had to know more. So for the first chapter of my PhD, I looked at 16 species of kangaroos, wallabies, tree kangaroos, and the tiny little rat kangaroos that are about the size of little rabbits. And you can see this plot here is a breakdown of skull shape into two main axes. And on the x-axis, you have shape that's related to size. So larger animals tend to have smaller brains, and you can see that the incisors tend to stick out a little bit more. But on the y-axis, that's relative face length. And what you can see here is that, yes, kangaroos, wallabies, tree kangaroos do seem to have this positive correlation of face length. But you know, the rat kangaroos didn't follow this at all. Instead, they followed what seemed to be more of a soft to hard food continuum, where the species that were eating softer foods had longer faces, and the ones that were eating harder foods like roots and tubers had shorter faces. And in fact, the largest species, the Rufous betong, had the shortest face out of the whole lot of them, which didn't really fit with the predictions of Kriya at all. So there had to be something more to this. So at the time, and to an extent still a lot today, the way we include diet into studies of morphology and shape is to just include it as a categorical variable, like carnivore, herbivore, grazer, browser, all that sort of thing. And so that's what I've done on this plot of that same paper. That's the same plot as the previous slide, just with the diet groups. But have a look at what happens when we look at the original plot from the 2015 paper suggesting that kangaroos and wallabies followed this Kriya pattern. You've got skull size and face length, positive correlation, but it also follows a browsing to grazing continuum. And this wasn't mentioned at all in that paper, but it really stood out to me. But as you will see, even these diet categories don't necessarily really provide enough of the full picture. In the end, the whole way I thought about this changed from one paragraph of one paper. And it wasn't a paper on skulls, it wasn't a paper on kangaroos, it was a paper on grasses. And in the final paragraph of that paper, it mentioned how large grazers reach down and they grab onto the grass and they pull it and they break it with tension, whereas small grazers, they're really little. They have to nibble at the edges of it and bite it away. And that got me thinking, hang on, they're in the same diet group, but they're using completely different actions. And so this started to really change the way I was thinking about how skulls are doing things. You can't really think necessarily about the diet groupings so much as the actions that are being used, the forces that are related to those actions, and how this might be mediating adaptation of the skull. So I sat on these ideas for a few years while I went and I did some postdocs in the US on other stuff, but I kept watching the space. And what I noticed was two research camps forming. One of them was researchers that were studying animals that supported Kriya. This is your cats, your ungulates, your rodents, and yes, still kangaroos and wallabies. And then there was the non-Kriya groups, researchers that were studying animals that didn't fit it. This was your cetaceans, your microbats, your primates, and some species of carnivores. And the frustrating part about this at the time was that the Kriya groups were hailing this as some fundamental pattern that is explaining everything about all that we see in the skulls of animals, and they even say vertebrates more broadly. But the non-Kriya groups just weren't mentioning it at all because it wasn't there. So something had to be done to unite these two camps. So when I moved to Flinders in 2021, I started putting together this big review, consolidating all of this information. And I tested the Kriya predictions across 22 mammalian families. And what we found was it was basically a pick'em. Kriya was seen in about half of the families. But what we did notice was it was more common in the species groups with shared ecology. This is similar biting behaviours, similar food requirements, similar mechanics, absolute mechanics that were required. And deviations occurred when you had abrupt diet shifts at the extremes of the sizes. So something like an orca, for example, is like a large dolphin, but it specialises in larger prey, so it needs a more robust skull to handle those forces. Whereas smaller species like nectar-feeding bats or honey possums don't need to bite very much, but they house a longer tongue or they need access to the nectar, and that's at the other extreme. So this was all kind of pointing towards the idea that the Kriya pattern itself was also related to bite force. And so we came up with a simple mechanism for biting animals. Doesn't work for non-biting animals, but we don't claim it's in all groups. And what it comes down to is that in smaller species, high mechanical advantage compensates for their smaller jaw muscles. So if you've got a small animal here with a given bite force, it gets bigger, everything gets bigger, including the muscles. More muscle force, bite force goes up. Bigger animals, if they're eating the same foods that the smaller ones are eating, don't need that much bite force, so they can reduce the leverage, right? And we see this sort of thing happening all over the place. This is warping of the smaller species of rock wallaby and the warping to the larger species of rock wallaby. And you can see that extension of the dentition pushing outwards in the larger species. And the reasons for that, so a short face is beneficial mostly just for biting hard. But a longer face is beneficial for any number of reasons. It can be faster jaw closure speeds. It can be reach. It can be, like I said, housing longer tongues. It can be better, more surface area for olfaction. Loads of reasons, which explains why it's such a common outcome as animals get bigger. And this all reinforced the idea that bite force is a massively dominant driver of skull diversity, even across body size ranges, which up to this point, most methods have been removing the effects of size to study adaptation. So let's circle back to the two species that I had on the title slide. Now that we know this relationship between size and bite force adaptation, firstly, these guys weren't small at all, and they also both show all the hallmarks of being able to generate incredibly high bite forces. And it can easily be argued in both these cases that they both can probably outcompete ecological equivalents of placentals around today. Let's start with the marsupial lion, estimated to have possibly the highest bite force of any mammal ever for its size. And that comes down to a combination of its extremely short face and those enormous cavities behind the cheekbones for housing ridiculously huge jaw muscles. You can fit your fist through there if the skull's big enough. Really big and impressive. And when you couple that with their iconic dentition that we all know and love, what you have is one of the most formidable biters of all time that rivals even some of the largest placental carnivores around today, like lions and tigers. More to the topic of today, though, let's talk about the short-faced kangaroos. Now, they do not follow this Kriya pattern at all, and it was a real thorn in the side of that original kangaroo paper. This is one of Gav's old papers, 2009, on Procoptodon, the largest species. Shows it as the short, really short face, and that's down to its diminutive anterior dentition, tiny little front teeth, but they have this enormous battery of cheek teeth running all the way back there. Right? And this was suggesting that they're feeding vegetation directly to the cheek teeth and bypassing the front teeth. And that's kind of a case of, use it or lose it in an evolutionary sense. So in 2019, I did a study just following my PhD on another species of Seniorine, which was Cymothoneurus occidentalis, another Narracourt one, I believe. And I compared that species with a koala, which is similar ecology, similar skull proportions. And what you can see is that the short-faced kangaroo has much lower stress during a simulation of a unilateral bite, a bite on one side of the skull. And this supports the idea that not only were they feeding lots of food to the cheek teeth, especially around that reinforced premolar, first molar region, but they're really well reinforced to resist the twisting forces that happens during those actions. And that suggests that they were capable of withstanding incredibly hard bites onto incredibly resistant vegetation. Another thing I suggested in that paper was that they must have had some modifications to their jaw muscles, because look at how far back this huge battery of teeth go compared to the koala. They're almost reaching the jaw joint. And that's really efficient. It allows you to convert a lot more of that muscle force to bite force, but it comes at the risk of potential injury to the jaw joints. You can dislocate your jaw joints if the piece of food becomes the fulcrum, the rotating point. So there had to be some way to stabilize the joint. And I noticed these enormous cheekbones on this species. And I was thinking that is the location of the origin of a muscle called the zygomaticomandibularis. And it tends to be part of the masseter system. It's usually a lot smaller. But what I suggested was that provided a large region for expansion of that muscle, which, as you can see, operates directly in between the rearmost teeth and the jaw joint, allowing a stabilized action during these ridiculously hard bites. So in other words, this animal was a powerhouse, able to crush pretty much any of this thick vegetation that it felt like, which is probably bordering on non-nutritional at all. And there is one other animal around today that has the same sort of adaptive system going on, and that is the giant panda. The giant panda has the largest zygomaticomandibularis muscle of all its relatives, of all carnivorans in general. It also has these similar skull proportions, but you know what? Which one do you think looks like it can handle more forces? I don't know. I haven't tested this yet, but looking at the proportions of the short-faced kangaroo, that looks like it can handle quite a bit more than the giant panda. So we have this repeated case of marsupials being able to, evolve these adaptations for high-performance biting, which tend to look like they can outdo a lot of placental counterparts. So there's a small caveat to all this, and that is that, especially going on to the following talks, the biomechanical research that I do, it can inform on capability, not necessarily actual diets through the life of an individual. And that's because skulls are a product of the legacy of the ancestors who had to survive through certain feeding behaviors to get them there in the first place. But in reality, animals eat a lot of different foods. They eat what's available, and what's available can change through changes in environment. They have to try to survive. So if you want to look at what individual diet variation is like, that's when you start to look at things like the dentition, which is coming shortly. So to summarize, it was through looking at kangaroo skull diversity that these new ideas about how the skulls of all animals and how they evolve and function came about. So thank you, kangaroos. It's becoming increasingly clear that maybe marsupials shouldn't be considered limited so much in their ability to diversify. They're just simply better at different things. And I'm sure if we were marsupials, we'd be looking at placentals and pointing and laughing and being like, you guys can't even bite hard, losers. So the big question that I'm interested in, which I think is very difficult to answer, but I like it, is could this tendency to evolve these high-performance behaviors be possibly related to the very first demands of their skull in the developing pouch of the mother? I don't know. I think it's a very cool idea, but we're only just scratching the surface, and I'm keen to see where we go with this. Thank you very much.
Cheers, Rex. Great talk. Anyone have a question?
Great talk. I was just curious, when you compared it to the giant panda, it looked like the panda had almost prioritized increasing the size of the sagittal crest.
Yeah.
Is that almost the same thing, just a different muscle that's enlarging, or does it have different results?
It has both. It's got really large temporalis muscles, which is partly to do with its ancestry as well, because they're very temporalis dominant, carnivorans in general. And it also has the largest one of those muscles as well. So the musculature is really interesting across animals, because the more dissections I hear people doing, the more it seems that they all blend together. So the more I hear about it, the more I wonder where the temporalis ends at the back of the arch and where it becomes zygomaticomandibularis, which is like an internal part of the masseter. It's hard to say, but yeah, the panda definitely has a huge space for temporalis attachment.
I was just wondering, you were saying that Simostheneurus and Procoptodon are eating low quality, coarse plant matter.
I was saying that they're capable of it.
Capable of it.
100% capable of it. If they have the choice, they probably wouldn't. What
Yeah.
animal would? But yeah.
But I was just wondering, would that mean that they would have the capability of like consuming like woody material like sticks or branches as well?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Similar to what's been argued and observed in elephants, the largest branch of a tree that has been recorded being eaten by a bull elephant is 8 centimeters thick. So they will eat it as well. I would assume that they might be, doing something similar if times become extremely difficult.
Yeah.
Interestingly, I did look into the physiology of salt bushes because it was shown through some of Gav's work that they were probably focusing on that at some point. And the salinity of the tissues of salt bushes increases the closer to the leaves you get. So the thicker material, the twigs and stuff, have less salt than the leaves, which I thought might be something interesting as an additional niche.
Thank you. That answered my question. Thank you.
Cool.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, the leaves that have more salt, but they've got more nutrition, so it'd be a trade-off.
Yeah.
Just a comment on that. One of the interesting things about a lot of the Australian native plants is that the green shoots are put up through the middle of the bush, and it's surrounded then by the spiny, particularly in the acacias, the spinier things are on the outside, as a way of protecting the more nutritious part. So I presume these guys, with their hard bite and so forth, can easily make a living out of the protective mechanism of the plant, the rough, tough, spiny stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. The general bow plan, I guess you'd call it, of the Seniorine skull, this short, chunky look that they have, it had to have come along from some pretty serious demands. But the way these things work is once you get there, and if times smooth out, if you go into a more lenient part of a glacial cycle or something like that, and everything becomes plentiful again, yeah, they'll go into eating other foods. They'll find other vegetation that's around. They won't necessarily eat that stuff that dictated that morphology in the first place. And that's where you get these disparities, these differences between the general morphology and the evidence you sometimes see in things like microwear.
That'll do for now. Well, obviously you can ask Rex questions later on in the piece, but let's thank him again for a great talk.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, that was a really great talk from Rex. It's actually just inspired me to move a few things back into my talk. Basically, I think I've got a few slides here. Yeah, I'm going to move my Precoptodon stuff back in if we have time. Okay, so cool. So that should be all good. Alrighty, so basically I'm going to be discussing today some of the work that I did during my PhD when I was supervised by Gavin, looking at kind of the unconventional way that kangaroos have adapted their dentition to Australia's unique vegetation. So first of all, just acknowledge the huge number of people that have been involved and facilitated the work that I'm going to present today. First of all, I want to acknowledge Rod for just sharing his huge wealth of knowledge and wisdom about all sorts of things, biomechanics, academia, ecosystems of Australia. We've had chats across all sorts of topics while I've been able to share an office with him, so it's been really fantastic. Obviously, Gavin, my supervisor, has been really tremendous in supporting my career, and a huge range of people who've been involved and contributed feedback and their time in helping to get some of this material scanned and analysed. So mainly today I'm going to be talking about grazers because the vast bulk of kangaroos in some shape or form are consuming grass. They're periodically grazing. And if we look at it, if we kind of step back and look at it in a kind of global context, really the last 30 million years have seen the rise of herbivores that are specialised for feeding on grass. On most continents, this has been hoofed mammals, particularly ruminants. So these are the cud-chewing hoofed mammals like antelope and deer, but also things like horses, rabbits, some rodents. So there's a real menagerie of grazers. Elephants are another example of animals that we might not typically think of as grazers, but do actually perform that periodically. But obviously, because Australia was separated during this period of kind of herbivore radiation and colonised, as far as we know, only by marsupials, in addition to monotremes, this grazing niche was filled uniquely by kangaroos. And if we look at just kind of the diversity of kangaroo diets, we can see that most of them are consuming grass in some form or another. And many of them are what we call mixed feeders, so they consume a bit of everything, which makes sense because you think about how variable Australian environments are, especially over the last few million years, over the ice ages. So grazing actually turns out to be a pretty challenging feat for herbivores because the herbivore teeth are actually right at the interface with the environment. So in the case of grazers, what's happening is that the teeth are experiencing damage continually through the millions of times that the animal is chewing during its lifespan from particles like grit that it's ingesting from the soil, things like phytoliths, which are the little siliceous inclusions in plant cells, and the enamel itself. So when the teeth get damaged, some of the enamel is actually damaging the opposing teeth as well. And the way that a lot of grazing herbivores have dealt with this problem is that they've made their teeth very tall crowns. So you get these very prismatic type teeth here in a horse, and these extend down into the jaw quite a way, and they actually grow for an extended period. And in some groups like rodents and rabbits, they actually continually grow throughout the life of the animal. So we have a really unique experiment here, and one idea that I find really interesting is this idea of thinking about evolution in more of an experimental way. So we have different groups, they're all often doing parallel things, invading parallel niches. And in Australia, we have this unique opportunity to compare what happens when a marsupial tries to fill a grazing niche. And you know, this, because of the isolated nature of kangaroo evolution, we can ask questions like, you know, do they fill it in the same way that hoof mammals do? And then we can also look at more detail and say, well, how important are ecological pressures in shaping the way animals look versus ancestry? Okay, it turns out when we actually we do a comparison between a hoof mammal like a sheep, a ruminant, with a kangaroo, a grazing kangaroo like the red kangaroo, it turns out they're actually really different in how they actually go about doing the grazing thing, okay? So if you look at sheep, they have a very extensive lateral chewing jaw motion, whereas with kangaroos, most of it is a vertical chewing component and a very small lateral component. But most of the fracturing is happening with this vertical chewing. Sheep tend to have these very complex crenulated type teeth with thin enamel, whereas when we look at kangaroos, we see that actually they have relatively simple in terms of the number of different orientations on the tooth surface, and they're more analogous to how a pair of scissors might operate in terms of the way they fracture food. And obviously, in terms of the crown height, we see that sheep have very high crown teeth, about 4 times higher crown than what we're seeing in a grazing kangaroo, which tend to have much more lower crowned, more scissor-like teeth, adapted for this vertical type of chewing. And so one of the things that became obvious when I was early on sort of working through my PhD is that actually we have 2 different kind of cohorts of herbivores, okay? And they're not at all how you would think, because it's got almost nothing to do with sort of their evolutionary relatedness, okay? So on the one hand, we have a lot of hoofed mammals, and they're filling a kind of adaptive peak here. So you can think of this as kind of the optimum where lineages want to get to. If they spend too much time down here, they're probably going to go extinct. So groups are trying to move up to the top of these peaks. And what we have is sort of high-crowned herbivores, lots of lateral chewing, complex teeth. So this is the hoofed mammals that we're all pretty familiar with: camels, deer, rhinoceros, horses, rabbits. But then over here we have another adaptive peak, and this is filled by this bizarre group, including things like tapirs, lots of extinct elephant relatives like dinotheres, also mastodons to some degree. Have things like manatees, if you believe it, have very similar teeth to kangaroos. Lots of primates and kangaroos, and also things like diprotodontids as well are another group that sort of fit in this zone. And several of these groups did evolve to acquire grazing diets, even though if we just look at their teeth, we'd probably say they're more like browsers. And so the question is, how do you become a grazer if you've just got these low crown teeth? So there'd been a lot of work done looking at enamel thickness in primates, and this was immediately a trait that seemed to be potentially important in the story of kangaroo evolution. So enamel is the hardest dental tissue, the hardest tissue in the skeleton, so it's a good candidate if you want to make your teeth last longer. And this had been shown to be very variable in primates, and especially it's very thick in some human ancestors, like the nutcracker man, Paranthropus boisei here, which has these tremendous buttressed jaws and seems to be very well adapted for resisting very high bite forces. When we compare it to, say, something like a chimpanzee, which has a more frugivorous, kind of omnivorous diet. So you can see here that there's a lot of stress or a lot of strain building up in the zygomatic arches compared with this extinct hominin. And so the idea in primate evolution for a long time had been that the reason for these massive buttressed teeth and thick enamel was for feeding on hard foods like the seeds that are in fruit. Okay, and this had been the paradigm. But what happened was that, like Rex was saying, the way your anatomy isn't necessarily indicating what you're actually eating. And when you look at the teeth of human ancestors, what you see is that many of them actually have really hammered surfaces with very heavy wear. So here we have, this is basically the species that Lucy belongs to. And if we look at Paranthropus boisei, the nutcracker man, very heavy damage. Much less damage on a gorilla, which is mainly eating like leaves and stuff, okay? And then if we look at microwear, which are the tiny scratches on the teeth, what we find is that actually a lot of these Australopithecine hominins, or hominins that are close to that base of the human family tree, actually have this very simple complexity in their microwear, which is potentially indicating that they're eating more fibrous food than what we would have expected based on their thick enamel. And really, there's only Paranthropus robustus that shows any real strong evidence for feeding on hard, brittle foods. Okay, and then lastly, stable isotopes. So stable isotopes are giving us information about the foods that are actually being incorporated into the animal during its lifespan. And what we find here is really surprising. We find that Paranthropus boisei, the most thickly enameled hominin, is actually plotting out with grazers like hippos and pigs and fossil horses. Okay, so it's nowhere near the browsing taxa like giraffes in terms of where it fits in its ecosystem. So this has all turned the whole thing on its head. Okay, and so we're going to have a look now. We're going to see, do kangaroos, are they evolving thick enamel maybe as kind of a parallel evolution to these human ancestors? And so to do this, we do micro CT scanning, and then we basically digitally extract the different tooth tissues, and we can compare very accurately how the enamel varies in different parts of the jaw and between different species. And what we found is that basically when we look at it across the different kangaroo groups, the different families and stuff, we find that obviously if you're a bigger animal, you tend to have more enamel in your teeth. So this is what we see with the Stenurians. Overall, they have the most massive teeth, they have the thickest enamel. But when we correct for body size, what we find is that it's mainly the grazing kangaroo family that tends to have very thick enamel. And the Stenurians actually have relatively thin enamel. And this kind of fits what we might think about. This makes sense because a lot of ungulates or browsing ungulates tend to have very thin enamel as well. And then when we look across diet, we see very clearly that if you're amongst extant kangaroos, obviously, because we don't know the diet of the fossil ones. But we know that we see that the grazing taxa, or taxa that are including a lot of grass in their diet, actually have very, very thick enamel, much thicker than the other groups of kangaroos. So supporting this idea. And then if we look at it in sort of an evolutionary sense, trying to understand the context of how this all happened, we can see that early on, kangaroos probably had relatively thin enamel, just like what we see in possums. And then we see multiple evolutions of thick enamel in different clades, okay? And in some cases, if you look at the rat kangaroos, this is probably related to adaptations for feeding on hard foods like seeds and nuts, okay? But in the grazing kangaroos, so these are the Macropodinae and also the banded hair wallabies, we see that very clearly that they have a much thicker enamel, and this we think is related to this invasion into the grazing niche. And when we look at it in the fossil data, we can see that this starts to develop by at least the late Miocene, so from about the time that perhaps the Alcuda local fauna extends to. This is, or actually it's not from there, it's actually from the Karamolka local fauna, so a little bit later, but again, it's starting much earlier than actually the first evidence for grasslands, which is kind of interesting. And we could interpret this possibly as indicating that we had an earlier expansion of grasses that we're not really picking up yet in Australia, or it's that it's maybe driven more by the dust flux that you're getting in like arid ecosystems, because remember I said that dust can be an important, or grit can be an important driver of dental durability. Okay, so let's try and look at it in context. Where do kangaroos fit compared with other animals? Okay, so like I said, as you get larger, you tend to have more enamel in your teeth. That makes a lot of sense. But we already see that the grazing kangaroos are sort of sitting out a little bit from the trend line for most other kangaroos. And when we can clearly see that taxa that are feeding on grass tend to have enamel that's, I believe, about 20% greater than the enamel that we see in other kangaroos. Okay, so now what I've just added on here is the primates, okay? And the first thing you can see is that primates traditionally were thought to be one of these really unique, thickly enameled clades, but they're actually not as thickly enameled as kangaroos, okay? And they're certainly not as thickly enameled as grass-feeding kangaroos. And the other thing that we should notice here is that look where the human ancestors are plotting. They're right next to our grazing kangaroo taxa, okay? So the red kangaroo, grey kangaroo, the wallaroo. So this is providing some really intriguing suggestions that these human ancestors probably, you know, they're convergent maybe with some of these grazing kangaroos. So, you know, maybe Lucy here was dreaming about grasses. Okay, so why do we see this kind of disparate? We have this dichotomy, right? We have these. We kind of have these thin enameled high crown taxa, these thick enameled low crown taxa. These guys are really more successful if you look at it in the broader context. These guys, kangaroos are certainly the exception, very diverse in Australia, but a lot of these other groups are part of clades that were formerly very, very speciose, and they declined through time, okay? So we can sort of see that basically there's a dichotomy here in terms of strategy. And we can also probably include in this clade here, we can also include human ancestors as well, maybe. I think what's going on here is that we have a situation where where you're going in evolution depends on your ancestry very strongly. So it's not as determined by ecology as we might like to think, okay? Certainly you have to understand the past to understand the future. And what we see here is that these transverse shearing, having ancestors where you chew laterally is very likely to lead you to evolve high crown teeth. Whereas if you have ancestors with what you could call them vertical slicing ancestors, okay, that have these like scissor-like teeth, you're much more likely to evolve thick enamel because it's much easier to make thick enamel work in that kind of a configuration. Whereas these guys, you want thin enamel. Okay, so I just added in a few slides here on Procoptodon because I think Rex's talk really nicely kind of links in with some of these ideas here. So Rex highlighted, you know, the kind of very robust cranium that we see in Procoptodon goliah especially, and a lot of Stenurians, this huge jaw musculature, have these very crenulated bulbous teeth. Now, if we look at the microwear, the story starts to get a bit confusing because we have things like, here we have a grey kangaroo. This is from Gavin's work. And the swamp wallaby. And the swamp wallaby has been periodically considered a browser, but based on its microwear and reanalysis of what it actually eats, we think it was actually doing a bit of mixed feeding. It was consuming a bit of grass and a bit of browse. And you can clearly see that really Procoptodon is very similar to Bullabia bicolor, the swamp wallaby, in terms of its dental microwear. So maybe it was mixed feeding, okay? And this is certainly supported by some of the work that Sam Arman, who some of you might know, has done recently, published a paper in Science, which supports this for other stenurines. So looking at the enamel data for Procoptodon, an interesting story or a hypothesis emerges here. First of all, this is a tree kangaroo, so this is your archetypal browser, and I've mapped here the enamel thickness through the tooth crown. And we can see this is the distribution for this is the frequency, how common the enamel thickness is, and this is the enamel thickness. So you can see the maximum thickness is up here for the different guilds. So tree kangaroos, they're way down here, they have really thin enamel. If we have a look at a kind of a grazer like the common wallaroo, we can see that its distribution is shifted up this way. It's got much more thick enamel in its crown. It has this really long tail as well, which is the stuff that's on the crests of the teeth, okay? Now, which one do you think Procoptodon is going to be more similar to? Okay, well, it turns out, I think, that it's much more similar to the wallaroo in terms of the distribution of enamel on its crown. And if we have a look here at the distribution fit of Procoptodon, it certainly is very closely matching the grazing kangaroos, which is like completely unexpected because, like I said, otherwise it has a relatively browser-type morphological setup. So what I think is going on here is that Procoptodon has basically gotten so big that it has so much enamel in its crown that it can sort of do what it wants, okay? And it's probably feeding a little bit on grass because it simply could. It could tolerate that for a period of its life. So, and probably for a lot of the other time, it was a tough browse consumer, but it's certainly not a dietary specialist, I would say. This is, I think, an interesting finding. But anyway, I'll just come to my final thoughts here. So kangaroos are part of this really unique herbivore group, okay? Really surprising. You wouldn't think that manatees and kangaroos or even human ancestors would have anything in common, but they actually do when you look at their teeth. And the other thing is that thick enamel is this kind of rearguard adaptation. It's like, well, how can we retrofit this type of tooth to be more durable? And thick enamel is one of the ways that kangaroos have done this. And this allowed them to escape the limits of their ancestral anatomy. And it really was crucial in them actually invading this grazing niche because a lot of their other, like I said, a lot of their other relatives like Dinotheres and tapirs are another example, none of those groups ever were able to really successfully fill the grazing niche, and they got outcompeted by ruminants. And so also what's interesting here is thick kangaroos is arguably reciprocally illuminating what's going on in human evolution. It's at least bolstering the story that we're getting out of the dental microwear and stable isotopes. And just want to emphasize this last bit, the past plays a causal role in how future events unfold, which kind of is it's kind of logical, but we don't think about it like that. And it's really important for paleontologists because we are the people who study the past, okay? And you have to understand the past to predict the future. I think this is one of the kind of key insights that kangaroos yield. So anyway, so that's it. Thanks for...
Thanks, Aidan. Brilliant stuff. Anyone have a question? Or you're thinking of one. Oh, sorry.
So with the last skull you showed there,
Yep.
What are the implications, I guess, for the ecology? Had they developed and then moved to grass, part because it got so big, or was it the availability of grass? Because the story was always that there was Rainforest Australia and leaves,
Right.
and then the specialists.
You mean with Procoptodon or with the other kangaroo? Procoptodon? I think with Procoptodon, it's I'm not 100% clear on exactly whether it was we could call it a fallback food that it feeds when it has to but doesn't really want to, or whether it was falling forward and feeding grass more opportunistically. It really depends on, what time of the year they were feeding on these things. Like grasses tend to basically grow in somewhat lower rainfall settings than some of the tough browse, but it's very similar. They're very similar in terms of their rainfall. So there may be other climatic variables that determine whether or not grass was more abundant versus chenopod. If Gav's hypothesis that they were feeding on these tough browse was true, I guess at the moment, maybe I just kind of speculated maybe it was a preferential thing, that they just preferentially feed on grass. And that could be advantageous because it gives them maybe grass is giving them access to resources that are, beneficial in their reproductive success, or I don't know.
Yeah, well, you didn't really mention it, but do you want to pop back onto that Procoptodon? Oh, that one will
The
do.
microwave one?
Yeah, but, Rod will remember the Gordon Sanson hypothesis that Procoptodon was a grazer from a long time ago.
That's true, yeah.
Do you want to?
Yep. Oh, yes, sorry, yeah.
Because one of the things that sets most grazers apart is the fact they've got all those extra ridges. And that's, Procoptodon Goliath's gone to town with those, developing all those extra ridges. So that's always been a bit of a mystery because it seems more of a grazy sort of thing. But it's like harks back to what Rex was saying. Obviously, at some point in their history, there was this drive to build this really robust skull. But then when you get further along the line, they're just set up to do whatever they want. Really, yeah, it's pretty cool.
I just have a question regarding that about the Australopithecines eating grass. Is there any idea why one lineage of them went to such a huge dietary shift, going from essentially things eating grass to things that eat practically everything except grass?
Okay, so first of all, it's debated whether it's just Boisei, the Nutcracker man, was the only one doing it. Because there's actually a paper that came out last year where
Australopithecus ate grass and they were into it.
Well, some people have suggested that
it's Paranthropus was not ancestral to us.
Yeah, right. So it might be something that actually originated even further back in the ancestry, because there's actually evidence that like Afarensis and
but I'm just wondering, like, if this was the case, it means that the human genus Homo actually has a very extreme difference ecologically from the Australopiths.
Yep. Well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the kind of genus distinction can confuse things because, like, my understanding is that early Homo is very difficult to tell apart from some of the Australopithecines. So it kind of creates this weird dichotomy. But they might, certainly at some point there's been a big jump in terms of the ecology of hominins and. Yeah.
Yes, for example, humans now, we are literally incapable of eating grass, so we've completely lost the ability.
Yep, exactly. We still have, I guess, some digestive remnants of our former ability to process herbaceous stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's probably more a question for the paleoanthropologists. I think I'll be too misleading if I go any further.
Hello.
Hello.
So you mentioned earlier that, so for example, dust and environmental factors can have a role in how thick enamel is. Do you think there's, I guess, what are your thoughts on how that might impact migration and like changing environmental conditions?
Okay, for any particular group or?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think. Well, it's a good question. Do animals follow habitats that they just fit, or do they move into new habitats easily? I guess is a debate that people have had. So I'm not sure how the effect of different types of damage on the teeth might have affected whether they moved into new niches or not. Yeah, I mean, yeah, so I'm not sure.
No worries. Well, we might move on there. Thank Aidan again for an awesome talk. Isaac to the stage.
Sweet, okay. From the sublime to the ridiculous. Right, okay. Thank you everyone for listening. I'm wrapping things up and I won't get too in the time of beer o'clock. Okay. So, I, about 2 years ago, finished my PhD on giant kangaroos of genus Protemnodon, which are part of a relatively recently evolved kangaroo tribe called the Macropodini. And since then, been publishing much smaller papers on Dorcopsins, and particularly fossil Dorcopsins, which are the forest wallabies, which today only live in New Guinea, but I used to live in Australia as well. It goes on. There's a modern one. And they're a more basal, sort of older fossil group of kangaroo. And that's meant that this research has allowed me to sort of look at the, I guess, the stem and the branch of kangaroos, as it were. Right, so I'm going to be talking about macropodine kangaroos in particular. The subfamily Macropodinae contains all but one of the living species of macropodid. So when I'm talking about macropodines, we're not talking about sthenurins, and we're not talking about lagostrophines, so we don't have the banded hair wallabies. Now, in the late Miocene, there was a big radiation that formed a lot of the basal groups of Macropodinae in response to the spread of aridification or open habitats across Australia. And this hypothesis is mostly based on molecular clock or rate of evolution analyses that say, okay, this is when this subfamily started to emerge, and also the ecomorphological evidence in their descendants, which is to say we have this group tied together by factors that, or features that seem to be associated with ability to move through open habitats. And also obviously the evidence of the aridification itself. But we haven't really had any direct fossil evidence from that period of said radiation. That's because the late Miocene fossil record in Australia is garbage. That said, one of the species that I've been working on has actually been known since 1967, but we haven't worked really on the postcrania yet. So in hopefully the next couple of weeks, a paper is going to come out about this taxon here, Dorcopsoides facilis, looking at the functional morphology of its limbs, and we've also recently published on Dorcopsoides cowpatensis, which is from Cowpat Hill on Alcuda. I think a lot of you will have been to Alcuda. And it's basically looking at these two species, which are the oldest macropodine kangaroos. And so while they're not ancestral to all macropodines, they're ancestral to all Dorcopsins, or, you know, an early stem. They have a lot, because they're so old, they have a lot of ancestral features of macropodines, or at least they're more likely to hold those. And the interesting thing to come out of the functional morphology, looking at these guys, is that they have, compared to modern forest wallabies, which are forest wallabies, they're not open habitat adapted, they have longer fourth metatarsals, they have very long, narrow tibiae, and they have quite a long, narrow calcaneus as well, compared with modern forest wallabies. So we see in this ancestral Dorcopsin this greater adaptation to moving quickly and efficiently through open habitats, which is very interesting because you look at macropodines, which, as I've said, radiated in response to open habitat movement across Australia, but you look at, for example, Dorcopsins, forest wallabies, not open habitat adapted. Dendrolagans, that's your tree roos, rock wallabies, paddy melons, not open habitat adapted. It's really only some of the Macropodini, the crown group, that are even open habitat specialized. And so it's very interesting to see in Dorcopsoides this evidence of the ancestral open habitat adaptations. Right. that's not really my point. Getting to the point of my talk. So the rise of the crown tribe Macropodini. Now, macropodons radiated a bit later with the mid-Pliocene spread of grasslands. Aidan and Gav in 2019 published a paper that really showed that despite what the molecular, or in contrast with molecular clock timing, it seemed to be that the radiation of macropodons happened a bit later than we've been thinking, probably in response to the spread of grasslands. And that brought about your big, iconic, fast-hopping, grazing red and grey kangaroos. But there's actually, unsurprisingly, greater diversity in the fossil record. For example, Congress kitcheneri, which was a semi-arboreal large kangaroo, and also the species of Protemnodon. Oh man, I don't know why I put the pictures in that arrangement. That's awful. Pressing on. So this is Protemnodon sneweni. It's the oldest postcranial material we have of Protemnodon. And if we take it to be the ancestral state for Protemnodon, which as far as the fossil record goes, it is, then we can say, okay, so they seem to have had open habitat adaptations grandfathered in, as it were. So we have quite a long face, which is associated with grazing behavior. We have a very long tibia, which implies typically in kangaroos of this size of short femur, which means it's hopping fairly quickly and efficiently. But then you look at the subsequent radiation of the genus Protemnodon and you say, well, do they continue in that macropodon trend? Do they become larger? Do they become more efficient at hopping? Do they become more grazing orientated? No, they go every which way. They get a bit weird. So Protemnodon anak, for example, anak has the longest neck of any macropodine. It's not giraffe level, but it is pretty long, and there's very little variation in all other kangaroos. Tree kangaroos seem to have short necks, but anak's just got a stonker. Don't really know why. Has the longest forelimb, and it has a very mobile shoulder joint. Not on Stenurin level, but maybe it was still nonetheless an overhead feeding specialist, which you'll agree is really not becoming more grazing orientated. Then we have, for example, Protemnodon tumbuna, which evolved from an Eastern Australian and New Guinean species, Protemnodon odobandus, which was a hopping kangaroo, just not a very specialised one. But then in New Guinea, it's specialised to the montane rainforests. Got this very robust ulna, this femur that's about the same length as the tibia, which means it was not hopping very efficiently or very quickly. If it could even hop at all, it may have been an obligate quadruped. And at 60 to 100 kilos for tumbuna, that's really not a morphotype that we have in modern kangaroo faunas. This is sort of, to me, the most sort of motivating and interesting contrast within Protemnodon, Protemnodon viator and mamkura. Now, these two species have practically identical teeth. They were confused for 150 years. It was a real mess. My job at the start of my PhD, the thing I was most motivated to do was figure out how to tell the teeth apart, and I had to land on the end of, can't tell them apart. Maybe someone will someday. But at present, it doesn't really matter because the bodies are so different. So they often get lumped and called quadrupedal together. But if you look at the skeletons, they're very different skeletons. So on the left here, we have various bones of Protemnodon viator. So this is the hand. The hand looks a lot like a red and grey kangaroo's hand. It's got fairly gracile metacarpals here. You compare that hand with this hand here, which is from one of the Narracourt caves. I think it's Robert's Cave. Does that ring a bell? One of those, yeah. It's a very cool specimen. I apologise, that photo's taken on an iPhone 6. But you can see here these very robust metacarpals. I mean, get a load of this one compared to that. This looks like a palicestid metacarpal. It's massive. And it just shows how much more time this kangaroo is spending with its hands pressed on the ground, bearing weight. And spreading its weight out, using its hands to change directions, things like that. We look down here. This is a fairly typical macropodon, calcaneus and cuboid. The cuboid, which is just ahead of where the leg meets the tibia meets the ankle joint, basically. It's tall like this, partially just to support the action of the foot as it hops. but also to stop, crucially, to stop the foot from bending at that joint when this big kangaroo pushes off. So that's why it's tall and narrow. And then you look across at Mamkura, it's nothing like that. It doesn't have this massive process down here, which also helps guide the large flexor muscles of the foot. It's much broader and shorter. And likewise, the calcanei are very different. This one supports action of the big flexor tendon outside of what we call the sagittal plane. So it's basically changing direction a lot more and moving a lot slower. So when people say Protemnodon, or they like to say Pleistocene Australian Protemnodon, were quadrupedal, well, Mamkura could well have been, or at least more quadrupedal, but Viator, maybe not. And a big part of what gives me confidence in saying that is the specimens from Lake Callabonna. So Lake Callabonna is a very special site. It's about 50,000 years old, the Protemnodon we have from there. There's about 15 specimens, including this one, which a lot of you will be familiar with. This is Protemna mum. She's got a joey in her pouch there. So this is the only confidently female fossil kangaroo, or I think possibly confidently female fossil marsupial, except for, I guess, a couple others that are in the lab. And what this and the other very cool specimens from Callabonna lets us do is investigate aspects of life history and ecology and locomotion that would otherwise not be visible in the fossil record. So I'm in the middle of a study that's looking at the body mass, making age estimates. Anusia Chinsami is doing bone structure histology on the femora and the humeri. I'm looking at the development of Protemnodon skeleton, comparing it to red and grey kangaroos, and looking at the presence of sexual dimorphism in the population sample as well. I don't have time to go over everything. I'm really excited about it though, so talk to me about it afterwards and I'll go on and on. But this is a little snapshot. So you can see here, this is estimated age, and this is the body mass estimate. First and foremost, Protemnodon viator and their relatives often get called too big to hop. That's because of this 160 kilogram hopping maximum, which is beyond that. They reckon that the gastrocnemial tendon, the massive one that inserts to the back of the calcaneus, would snap if you tried to hop quickly when you weigh over 160 kilos. But as you can see here, none of them are actually really getting close. They seem to be flattening out pretty solidly along 100, 120 kilograms. And presumably, there would have been much bigger specimens, but the bulk of this population, at least, are staying really only just above the maximum red kangaroo mass, which is about 90 kilograms. So describing them as too big to hop, as far as we know, just isn't really accurate. Another thing is that you can see here, so this is a well-established pattern that we know of in red and grey kangaroos, other species of Ospharenta as well. This has the euro in it. For the first 2 years, they grow very quickly, and then they change their type of bone growth, and it slows till about 5 years when females stop growing, and the males keep growing, but very slowly for the rest of their lives. And just prior to that 2 year mark, when the bone growth slows, is when living kangaroos, large kangaroos, hit sexual maturity. And we can see, although obviously there's a lot fewer dots, something pretty similar happening in Viator. So that's our single joey there, without which we would be lost. But you can see that you get to 2 years and it pretty solidly flattens out. So we can start to hypothesize a pretty similar arc in terms of skeletal maturity and growth in Protemnodon viator. Now the joey. Joey's fascinating. So age estimates put the joey at about 7.5 months old with light cheek tooth wear, which means it's out of the pouch now and just started eating, which puts it pretty much in lockstep with the timing that red and grey kangaroos leave the pouch, which is pretty fascinating because at 7.5 months old, we put it at over 20 kilograms, which might be an overestimate. Usually this sort of estimate doesn't include juvenile skeletons, but even then, it's clearly much, much larger than any red or grey kangaroo joey ever gets. So it's got the same timing of its development, but with way, way, way more growth within the same timescale. In the bone histology, we have very, very rapid growth in the femur, something called radially organized fibrolamellar bone. I have to cheat every time I say that and read it up there. But basically, that's a very, very fast method of bone growth. It's the fastest that mammals use. And it's not present in the humerus, but it is present in the femur. And that's actually, in response, it's catch-up growth following ossification heterochrony, which Rex actually mentioned, which comes about as a result of the pinky kangaroo, when it's born, and it has to crawl out of the cloaca all the way up into the pouch and into the nipple to feed. It needs to have a very well-developed head and forelimbs compared to the rest of the body, which don't matter until later. But then obviously a kangaroo, the legs are pretty important. So they've got to grow really, really quickly to catch up. And in red and grey kangaroos, obviously the moment the joey's leaving the pouch, mum might have to clear off and hop away quickly at any moment. So they've got to be able to keep up. So they go as fast as they can, growing these really big legs. So it's really interesting to see this in Protemnodon viator, this bone growth which is reflected in the massive development of the hind limb compared to the tiny gracile forelimb. And what this says to me is there's clear developmental pressure on rapidly developing a fast hop. Why would they be doing that? Why would the joey be putting all of that effort in to growing this hind limb at the expense of the forelimb if it weren't a hopping kangaroo? Just doesn't stand to reason. Yeah, I think that's all I've got. But just to wrap up, why does any of this matter? Why do we want to know what ancient animals in Australia ate? Why do we want to know what fossil kangaroos, how they moved, where they lived, how they compared to living kangaroos? First of all, it's fun to do, but I think the most motivating thing for me now is in the context of our warming climate and the massive changes we're making to ecosystems globally. We're getting into a globe that we no longer really understand. And we need to start to look at where the Australian bush might go. And, you know, we think we know Australia now, but obviously 50,000 years ago, it was very, very different. And there were these massive ecosystem engineers walking around everywhere. But you see this lovely painting here. I love seeing them, but I was thinking about it when I chose this picture. They're never doing anything in these pictures. Do you know why? It's because we don't know what they bloody did. They were just walking around shouting at each other. We still don't know what they did. And so until we know what they did, how they interacted with each other, how they affected their environment, you know, in terms of their entire presence as a group, as individual species, what their disappearance did on a continental scale, on local scales, all of those things, how it affected bushfires, how it affected habitat structures, all of that stuff. We won't know, you know, the context into which we want to, I don't know, rewild some marsupials. You know, they didn't evolve in the bush that they have now. They evolved in this bush. You know, so what do we recreate? We need to be very deliberate in that kind of thing. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say. Oh, I forgot to say that bit. I'm going to say that now. If anybody tells you that, I don't know, Procoptodon or Protemnodon or something like that can be replaced by, for example, a donkey on the landscape, tell them they're dreaming. They don't know. I'm telling you that now. We don't know what they did yet. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Isaac. So I've just established that the pizza's just been put out and it's getting cold, so we've got time for 2 questions. Let's run a cold pizza. All right, who's got a question? Tom.
Hi. Is there a consensus on why there's such difference in the postcranial elements of Protemnodon species, but not the dentition?
No.
Okay. Thank you.
No, there's still. So Sam Arman's the person working on their diet, looking at the microwear. He's published a little bit, well, a lot of data from Naracoorte, but from memory it's only got Protemnodon mamcura in it. But that was one of the few kangaroos that came out as an obligate or very focused grazer. which was interesting because Protemnodon have been called everything. Sort of since the 60s, people were saying browser, mixed feeder grazer, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, the only one we can say with confidence at the moment is the one that looks sort of least like a modern grazing kangaroo. Mamkura was eating pretty much only grass. But yeah, I can't say much more beyond that. Pizza time?
I think it could be. Thanks so much, Isaac. That was a great talk, and please join me in thanking Isaac and Aidan and Rex and Rod for great talks and making today a fantastic event. Thank you.